Hi everyone, this is Paul Hitchcock with BarthCalderon. Thanks for jumping on Wealth Protector TV. And I am really fired up today to be here with my colleague Brian. Brian, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, Paul.
Oh, great. Well, we're going to jump right into this because this issue is on the minds of a lot of people. By now, all you listeners out there, you probably have heard of the passing of Aretha Franklin, and she died without a will or a trust. And so we've been getting just a ton of questions about what actually does this mean. And so, Brian, what happens when your spouse or any loved one passes away? I guess particularly your spouse. What are the issues involved?
Sure. If you don't mind, Paul, I'm going to share a little story. Actually, my best friend, his father passed away last week unexpectededly, and it was a little bit of a shock for me, just because this is somebody that I'd grown up with. I knew his father well. He's watched me grow up since elementary school, and it was a little bit of a shock to hear that this happened.
Sure.
And kind of helping his family. He was survived by his spouse and also his two children. And I think this is a good place to start, because this is something that a lot of people, a situation that a lot of families find themselves in. It's easy to procrastinate when it comes to doing your estate planning, and in this case, this family was no exception. They had no planning, so so Dad died, as we call it in the business. Dad died intestate, which means that he didn't have any planning in place. He didn't have a will or a trust or anything along those lines. So now we're we haven't really started this process, but we're going to be going into kind of figuring out how everything was situated to determine what work needs to be done.
And it's not uncommon for people not to have their planning done. Aren't the stats like kind of over 50% still don't have planning in place?
Yeah, it's a pretty, the numbers that I've heard can vary, but I'd say at least 50% of the people out there haven't done their planning. And it's a hugely critical thing to do. Obviously, as the more we age, the more critical it is for really a couple reasons. One is our mortality risk becomes higher, and also as we age, we tend to accumulate more assets. So we have more bank accounts, more properties, businesses, insurance policies, and all of these things require administration. So they require our time and attention to make sure that they get to where we want it to go. And there are a whole host of issues that pop up. So
if you don't have the planning, then you go to probate, and then what's the downside of that?
Sure. So this is a pretty broad topic, right? So it will range on a whole host of things. One of the big things that occurs is, how are your assets situated, right? So the first thing that you want to figure out after somebody passes away is, hopefully they've done the planning up front, but that's the first thing that I want to know as a planner, is to get a handle on, okay, what kind of assets did this decedent own, and how did he own those assets, right? Were those assets held, and we'll use my friend's father as an example, did he hold all of his assets in his name only? Was his spouse named on title to their real estate, to their bank accounts? If so, were they held jointly as joint tenants, or were they held as tenants in common? And so these are legal terms that have significant effects on how these assets need to be administrated so that they get to the right people. And so you had asked a little bit about probate, Paul, and so this is something that's hugely important when it comes to estate planning. Is if we don't plan properly, what oftentimes happens is those assets will end up in court. And so when those assets end up in court, it goes through what's called probate court. And probate court, the idea of probate court is to figure out, okay, the person who passed away, what did they own, and where did they want those assets to go? And if we don't specify where we want those assets to go, then the state has their own plan as to how these assets get to where they're going. So it may end up in the hands of his kids, it may end up in the hands of the spouse, but that's really to be decided by a judge, figuring all of that stuff out, looking at all the facts.
Which nobody ever wants, right? I mean, nobody ever wants that, right? I mean, when you go into probate, it's a public issue. The courts step in. It's like they start making decisions, personal decisions for you, not good.
That's correct. So the control lies in the hands of the court unless you take control and specify what those wishes are, right? The other thing that's really bad about probate is it's a public proceeding. So anytime you end up in court, things typically become much more expensive. They become a lot more time consuming. A general garden variety probate in California typically will run anywhere between a year or two. And that's even if you have a very simple estate, a house and a bank account. It's not uncommon for it to take 18 months to 2 years to get from start to finish to get everything to where it needs to go. And in more extreme cases, like for instance with Aretha Franklin or somebody like Prince, who's passed away with significant assets where there may be contention amongst family members or more complicated business assets or intellectual property that needs to be litigated, that can take several years and in some cases decades to resolve. So it's expensive, it takes a long time, and it's also public. So people don't like the idea of all their assets sitting out in the public domain for any Tom, Dick, Harry off the street to see what kind of assets they have and where everything is going to go. They don't want their children to be treated differently because all of a sudden everybody kind of treats them like lottery winners because they're coming into some sort of inheritance.
Right, yeah. And I think I already read something about Aretha Franklin that some long-lost relative is stepping out. But my question to you then is, what are the basics, real quickly here, what are the basics of the estate plan? What should people have in place?
Sure. So ideally, in most cases for people that have accumulated assets, right? If you have a house, you have bank accounts, etc. Most Californians, most middle-class Californians on up will probably be best served by having a comprehensive estate plan, which includes a living trust, wills, powers of attorney, healthcare directives, right? So your living trust is essentially it's a management entity that holds title to all of your assets, your house, your bank accounts, your investments, etc., so that in the event that you either die or become incapacitated, that the mechanisms are already in place for your trustee, your vice president, to be able to step in and manage things and get them to where they need to go. So beyond that, there are other documents that kind of support that. So there's your power of attorney and your healthcare directive, which give your loved ones the ability to make your financial decisions and your healthcare decisions, again, in the event that you're incapacitated and you have no ability to advocate on behalf of yourself, then the right people have the ability to step in and carry out your wishes without having to go to court. Because even when you're alive, right, if you don't have the right mechanisms or the right planning in place, your loved ones will oftentimes have to end up in court and they'll have to go through something called a conservatorship hearing, which is similar to a probate except you're still alive. And that would then be ongoing for your lifetime until you recover. And so that's also very expensive and it's very unwieldy because you have the court in your business. In most cases, that's not an ideal situation for most families.
Right. So I'm saying the takeaway here is we kind of hit the wall here on timing, but the takeaway is if you don't have any planning, you're going to court, public issue, and it can get real crazy, at least get the basics in play and take control of your planning. Would you say that's a fair assessment? Yeah,
I would say there's really a couple of takeaways that I hope that our listeners get from this, right? Which is, one, if your spouse has recently passed away or if they've passed and you didn't know what to do, first step is to call an attorney and to figure out, to get an assessment, to figure out what do we need to actually do here. In many cases, it might not be terribly complicated. Like for instance, in the situation with my friend, I'm optimistic that his wife won't have too much to do in the sense that they owned most of their assets together. So there's something called the right of survivorship, and their kids all get along, right? So in that case where you have a well-functioning family and everyone's kind of on the same page, there are the possibility that we'll be able to get things done quickly and efficiently is good. I'm optimistic. It doesn't guarantee anything, but that
Right.
I think that that's in this case that's a potentially relatively straightforward administration. But it's important to kind of get a handle on what the issues are, right? If we have to go to court, if we need to contact different governmental entities, if we need to manage expectations with regards to kids or stepkids or other people that might have a right to some of those assets, those are all
Right.
important things to know up front.
Right.
The other takeaway is if you haven't done any planning, or let's say you have a spouse that's in poor health, it's usually much, much easier to do the planning while somebody is still alive. And it's better to contact an estate planning attorney to make sure that all those ducks in a row, because the worst case scenario is that planning doesn't get done, and then all of a sudden we all end up in court suing each other, or we have to spend a lot of time and money just to get everything to the spouse, which, had we done the planning up front, could have been much easier and much more simple.
Right. Brian, fantastic information. I'm traveling again, so got the lovely background here. I know you're very busy, but great information. Thanks, everybody, for jumping on, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks, Paul.